Our last panel speaker is Shelly Ann Galpin. She's a third-year PhD candidate at the University of York. We seem to have a lot of people from York here today, studying under the supervision of Professor Andrew Higson. Her PhD research looks at the ways that teenage audiences respond to period drama. In addition to this, she also researches literary adaptations on screen and the ways in which history is represented through film. Prior to her PhD, Shelley worked as an English teacher specialising in further education. She also has BAs in English and in film and media and a master's in Victorian studies, during which she wrote her dissertation on Hardy's novels and Darwin's theories of sexual selection. She's published in the Journal of British Cinema and Television and Studies in European Cinema. And she also contributed a chapter on Vinterberg's Far from the Madding Crowd, which is in a forthcoming collection on adaptation and national identity. And Shelley is going to talk to us today specifically on teenage responses to the 2015 movie version of Far from the Madding Crowd. Welcome, Shelley.
Hello. Thank you. Hi. Yeah, so slightly different. I'm talking about the film, not the novel, so apologies to purists. But this is based on my PhD research, which has been looking at how teenagers respond to period drama in general. So what I'm going to do is share with you some data which I've gathered about how they respond to the 2015 film. Okay, so I'm going to get on to talk about Far from the Madding Crowd soon, but just to give you a little bit of background, I'm just going to talk about the study in general, just so you understand the context in which I gathered the data. So essentially, I needed to recruit some teenagers in order to let me kind of experiment on them and show them lots of period dramas, which I did, which was actually quite a difficult thing to do, but I got in touch with loads of teachers and found a few that were willing to let me kind of use their students in my study. So I kind of recruited them, and then I had to kind of narrow down 5 period dramas, and over a period of kind of weeks or months with these various young people that I was working with, I screened different period dramas. As was kind of inevitable, I started off with loads, well, actually not loads, but I started off with quite a few, and then numbers dwindled. You know, people kind of turn up a couple of times and then think, oh, sod this. So sadly, the ones that were at the beginning of the study have more kind of data than the later ones. But yes, that's how it is. So then once they'd watched each one, I asked them to fill in a survey to kind of get their immediate responses about what they thought about them. I also collected kind of demographic data, where they lived, their background, things like that. And at the end, I asked them to kind of fill in an overall survey, and I carried out, with the ones that did make it to the end, I also did sort of focus group discussions where I asked them to just talk to me in a bit more detail about what they had thought about the various things they'd watched. So I'm going to share with you kind of survey responses and extracts from focus groups and things like that. Okay, so these were the 5 that I used in my study. So we've got I'm going to guess you've heard of most of these, but I'll just run through them really briefly. So Peaky Blinders, which I kind of started off with because I thought it was a bit cool and edgy, and I thought hopefully that would persuade them to carry on coming to my study. And the second one was Belle, which is a really interesting film if you haven't seen it, which is all about kind of a mixed race young woman who was brought up within a kind of aristocratic family in the 18th century, which is sort of based on a real figure. Then Benedict Cumberbatch in The Imitation Game, which kind of Alan Turing saves the world by inventing computers single-handedly, according to the film. Downton Abbey. You've all heard of Downton Abbey. And finally, Far from the Madding Crowd. So it was the last one that I showed. So as per my previous point, sadly, numbers had dwindled by this point, so unfortunately I have slightly less data on this than I would have done had it been earlier in the study. But by this point, I did also kind of know my participants quite well, because I'd sort of met them several times, so that in some ways that was a plus. So this is the data from the Summative Survey, where I kind of asked them which one out of the 5 did they like the most, and which one did they like the least. So this one over to the side, to the right, is which one did you like the most, and the yellow is Far From the Madding Crowd. So you can see it was quite popular, actually. More people said that was kind of their favourite one, that they liked it the most than anybody else, followed by Peaky Blinders, and also The Imitation Game was fairly popular. But head over to the other pie chart, and you can see Far From the Madding Crowd was also one of the most popular ones in terms of the one that they liked the least. So they also, when asked kind of which one they liked the least, many people also said that. So it was actually incredibly divisive. Also Peaky Blinders, I'm not here to talk about Peaky Blinders, so I won't talk about that, but that also kind of had a similar effect. They tended to either love it or hate it. Okay. So yeah, as I've kind of identified, it was very divisive. People tended not to be lukewarm towards it. They either really, really got into it, or they absolutely passionately hated it. And I'm going to give you examples of both of those types of response. But one thing that was interesting for me, and because it was the last one in the study, I kind of got to see this more, but groups that had kind of sat there very politely and just sort of watched without doing very much suddenly were getting like really involved, which I was not expecting, to be honest, with this film. And they were just, they were talking to each other all the time. They were talking to the screen. And I was kind of, okay, I didn't expect this necessarily from this Thomas Hardy adaptation, particularly considering some of the other stuff, like Peaky Blinders or whatever, which you might think would be kind of cooler or a bit more exciting. So this was kind of interesting. Okay, so things that they liked about it. They found it suspenseful. They found it had multiple plot twists. They liked the development of the character, how it took her so long to realise what she actually wanted. Some people liked that. But they found it really kind of engaging. They found it twisty. They were really they really wanted to know what was going to happen next. So yeah. Sorry, you're not going to be able to read that. But this is an extract from a focus group. I was kind of talking to them about whether they could relate to it, and they were kind of saying, no, everything's a lot different now, really. One young woman said, even like with the whole love situation, I wouldn't go out with someone and be like, will you marry me, like 10 minutes after I've met them, which they all thought was hilarious. I kind of said, you seem to be finding that quite funny, and they were like, yeah, it's just weird, it's really funny, it's weird. And they were like, why would you go up to someone and be like, you've got a farm and a piano, I'm going to marry you? And she says, it's like all they seemed to want was like a farm and a piano, like, that's it, they'd be sorted for life. They thought it was kind of hilarious in a sense and completely, unsurprisingly, unlike anything in their kind of frame of reference. But for this group, this was not damaging their enjoyment. I think in a way it kind of added to their enjoyment. They sort of, because it was so kind of unusual for them, I think they sort of got into the whole kind of excessive melodrama of it, and they just sort of went with it and suspended their disbelief and got on with it. Okay, so this was another group. So this was a college, those previous ones were all from a college in Norfolk. This is a college in Lancashire. So I'm asking them about why they were because they also were kind of reacting to it, talking all the time. So I'm kind of saying, okay, why were you doing that? And they were like, because we passionately hated it. So I'm kind of saying, okay, but why were you sort of talking? Why were you verbally gesturing? It was so horrible that we felt like we had to comment. One girl was saying, it's all the cliches. It's kind of predictable. It's what everybody expects a historical drama to be. And this young woman at the end says the film's storyline went really, really quickly and then really, really slowly. And it was just infuriating, which kind of seems quite contradictory, but I think I kind of know what she means. They felt like there was way too much going on and it wasn't very plausible, and they just got really bored by it, basically. So I think, too, I mean, I'm going to guess a lot of you have probably seen this film, so I won't sort of talk about it in too much detail, and we've also already heard about it, but it is quite squished. Those of you who have kind of seen it, if you know the novel, it's like on to the next thing. And I think this is partly why. For those who enjoyed it, it's because it's constantly moving on to the next kind of interesting event or whatever. So I think for some of them that actually contributed to their enjoyment. For others, they just thought it was completely ridiculous. They found it, some kind of found it twisty and engaging, but others just sort of thought it was stupid. I think also I've kind of noticed in my research there tend to be a lot more biopics and less sort of adaptations of fiction these days. Feel free to argue with me about that. But Hardy's novels, I love Thomas Hardy, but they're not always best known for their kind of plausibility, or, there's a lot of coincidences, and I think things like that tend to play slightly less well. Like, I tended to find that sort of real-life stories or biopics seem to go down a bit better in some ways. And I think the fact that this film, as we've heard earlier, foregrounds the kind of Gabriel and Bathsheba relationship, and it does sort of make it slightly more predictable, I think. Which one of them kind of said, the minute he turned up at her farm, I knew that she was going to marry him, which kind of happens right near the beginning. So I think a lot of them kind of found it a bit predictable. In fact, some of them sort of turned it into a sort of a game that were going to predict what was going to happen next. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of specific responses to the character of Bathsheba. But in order to contextualise it, I'm just going to talk briefly about how they responded to some other female characters. So in Peaky Blinders, they really liked the strong women in Peaky Blinders. So Polly Shelby got, these are all female, young women at the top saying it's really interesting, it's nice to see a strong woman in a time period where in reality there were few. And also referring to the character of Grace in Peaky Blinders, who's a slightly younger female character. The next quote, she says, she's a complex female character, I think that's cool. So we've got kind of strong, complex female characters are being kind of well received. In Belle, I liked how she was strong and never gave up on what she believed in. And then in The Imitation Game, Keira Knightley's character, they also, I won't read that whole quotation, but they like the fact, it says she's strong-minded, accepting and a brave person, does not allow society to disregard her. Lots of people also really liked Keira Knightley's character in that film, kind of saying, I really liked how she was really strong and, bucked the trends of the age and all of that kind of stuff. So with all of this, I was kind of, this is interesting. I wonder what they're going to think of Bathsheba, because she's a strong, complex woman. So actually, it kind of bucked the trend in that sense. So for most of for pretty much all of them, if you ask them their favourite character, often they would say the protagonist, which is kind of, as you might expect. So they like the character of Alan Turing in The Imitation Game, for example. This one massively went against that, though. I think about the 20 people who filled in the survey on this film, only one of them said they liked the character of Bathsheba. All the rest said that they liked the character of Gabriel Oak the best. In fact, it was the most kind of uniform of all of my surveys. So in most of them, there was a big kind of range. Sometimes they'd go for kind of quite random characters, like, really, you like the guy who drives the cart? But, they would sort of, there was often a kind of surprising range, but with this one, it was incredibly, everyone liked the character of Gabriel Oak much better than Bathsheba. So let's talk about why. So the quote down there, so it says the woman was a walking contradiction. They didn't really like the fact that, she didn't know what she wanted. And the top one, I mean, some of you may find this kind of a familiar argument. It says young man very strongly felt this. He said it was garbage. The premise of the plot was based around a farmer finding herself and being a successful farmer, and somehow it ended up in a stupid find your husband gambit that took the entire film. And I've called this a kind of a hot critical response. It's kind of critical in the sense that it's very sort of ideological, and hot in that he was incredibly kind of emotionally charged. I mean, and he talked in the focus, I could have got loads of quotations, but he was saying, it makes me so angry, it makes my blood boil, that he was really, really angry about it. I think interesting also that this was a male student who was very much kind of driving this. The whole group kind of agreed with him, I think, but he was certainly the main force behind it. So yeah, they kind of really felt like it started off quite promisingly. They liked the whole kind of feminist thing of that she was going to have her own farm or whatever. And then they were like, oh, what's all this stuff about all these stupid men? They really, really didn't like it. Okay, a very different response, but also I think quite interesting. This is a school from Camden in London. This was an all-male group, actually, kind of quite surprisingly. So I talked to them a little bit about I was asking them whether they could relate to Far From the Madding Crowd or if they thought that some girls might relate to it more than they could. And they kind of said, yeah, she might relate to the female character more. And then one of them says, like, being promiscuous. I was a little bit shocked at this coming up. And one of them says, yeah, she was just promiscuous to get some land. I'm saying, was she promiscuous? I didn't quite know how to deal with this line of argument. And they were saying, well, she was getting with 3 different guys at the same time. At which point I said, not at the same time, one after the other. Which I tried to be quite neutral in my focus groups, but I just couldn't resist, to be honest. It just came out. And they were like, yeah, but it's like a matter of days. Whilst talking to the other ones, it's like she messaged 3 guys and got one at a time. So they're relating it to sort of contemporary female behaviours. And then they said, yeah, she is a bit of a J. She's a bit of a J-bag, which was not a term I was familiar with. So I Googled it. It means Jezebel or promiscuous woman. So this I also found really interesting. I mean, they're taking a very kind of moral stance against Bathsheba. They find her really immoral in terms of her kind of sexual behaviour. I think they're very... seems to suggest a sort of a suspicion of female sexuality, of female agency, kind of possibly within the fact that they relate it to modern behaviour suggests to me that this also says something about their kind of modern attitudes, which I wouldn't want to kind of label this group specifically, but I think it says something about the kind of circles in which they move, that this was how they interpreted that character. I mean, particularly the comment about her being promiscuous to get some land, which I don't think is even true, really. But it's interesting that was how they perceived it. They've very much gone for this sort of gold digger, whore kind of images, which I don't even know that there's that much textual evidence for, but it's interesting that this is how they responded to it. There was a small number of positive responses to Bathsheba. One of them kind of related to her. She said she reminds me of myself. Another one says kind of this longer quotation. She says it started out with her, making her own business, doing her own farm, and then eventually, it was always her choice. She didn't always make the right choices, and some of those came back to bite her, but at the end of the day, it was always her choice. So some of them kind of like the fact that actually, she doesn't always do the right thing, which kind of none of us do. It's sort of interesting that actually I think in some cases it was female participants who were more forgiving. They kind of liked the fact that, she was her own person. But this was very much the minority view, I have to say. And I kind of relate this to, I think, ideas around sort of women, female characters in general. So Sarah Art introduces this idea of, she says, male characters, we're quite willing to forgive, we're quite happy to sort of like male characters who often behave in sort of problematic ways, but female characters, we sort of expect them to be likeable. And Bathsheba isn't always likeable, and I think she's slightly fallen victim to this in some ways. And very quickly, so Gabriel, they thought he was very, I mean, he's just very good, isn't he, basically? He just does everything right, so they just really liked that. They found him the values that he kind of embodies to be things that they could get on board with, and they just all kind of talked about the fact that he was hardworking, he put other people before himself. This was a lot more accessible for them than kind of having to negotiate Bathsheba's slightly strange choices at times. Okay, so conclusions, I'm going to skip this, but essentially what I've already said about they liked Bathsheba less than Gabriel. Finally, I think it's interesting that some of them did find them kind of unrealistic and contrived, but there is still evidence there that even in the negative responses, that there was kind of universal ideas coming there, and some of them at least were able to kind of find things that they could relate to and that made it kind of feel relevant to their contemporary lives. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Shelley.